Good morning and welcome to the third session of our Impactability Learning Series with our hosts Alan Mansky and Vickie Kamak. My name is Ted Kuntz and I am Chair of Plan Institute. I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Sorry about that. The mission of Plan Institute is research, education. I need to have a coffee. Sorry about that. The mission of Plan Institute is research, education, and dissemination of social innovations developed by Plan families. We look for opportunities for dialogue, collaboration, and partnership. And so we are pleased to work with Tamarack Institute as our partner in this series. Tamarack is one of the leading organizations in collective community impact. This 7-part webinar series focuses on the impactability of individuals in the disability movement. Al and Vickie have noticed that people with disabilities and their families have a distinct talent for achieving impact by continuously inventing and creating their way out of adversity. Al and Vickie are recognized worldwide as family leaders. They have a talent for recognizing new ideas and innovations and bringing these ideas to scale. Today's session is entitled Setting the Table for Allies, Adversaries, and Strangers. Al and Vickie have invited as their special guests Ben Weinlick, founder of Think Jar Collective. We trust that today's discussion will assist you in setting a table of your own, one that encourages, engages, and inspires innovation and impact. And now I'd like to welcome the hosts of Impactability Series, Alan Mansky and Vickie Kamak.
Why, thank you, Ted, for your kind introduction and words. And welcome, everybody. Welcome from far and wide. Vickie and I understand we've got folks joining us from New Zealand, Australia, United Kingdom, United States, and of course, Canada. And if we've missed anyone, do let us know. It's so nice to have all of you with us. Like every one of the patterns in the book Impact, setting the table is a metaphor. It's a metaphor for talking or dialogue. It's a metaphor for who we work with, for working together, working not just with friends and allies, but also with strangers and adversaries. Our movement, our world has arrived at a time in history when we can no longer afford to go it alone. And a movement as old as ours is bound to accumulate bruised egos and betrayals and suspicion and mistrust. Well, it's time to make peace with all that. By moving beyond old hurts and faulty assumptions, we position ourselves to realize our boldest dreams. And one of the ways we can do that is to set a table big enough, not just for the usual suspects, but for the unusual suspects. And if we do so, it will enable our movement to advance the next stage of the disability agenda. Today's guest, Ben Weinlick, does all that and more, much more. Ben hails from Edmonton, where he established Think Jar Collective and the Citizen Action Lab. He's part of a growing group of young innovators who are pioneering new ways of bringing people together to talk, to act, and to do social change a little differently. And it's our good fortune that he operates from a base in the disability world. Ben's language is as refreshing as his talents. I suspect you'll hear references to pop-up labs, mash-up, iterate, think jars, deep dives, co-design, human-centered design, and so on throughout our conversation. So hold on to your folks' hats. Hold on to your hats, folks. This is one hip young man. Ben, stoked to have you with us. You're a busy guy.
Thanks for having me. No, it's great to be here. I don't know if my kids would say I'm a hip young man, but sure, I'll take that. Still, that's good. No, but really great to be here and talk about all these things.
Well, wonderful. We're just delighted to get the conversation rolling, Ben. You understand that you've got a couple of pretty significant innovations under your belt at this point. that you're stewarding, and one is a social lab, and the other is a collective. And we're definitely wanting to talk about both, but we thought we'd start the conversation just exploring this idea of social labs. And we hear about labs a lot these days, popping up in various places, and I'm pretty sure that a social lab is not the kind of laboratory I used to know in high school that had test tubes and experiments going on. So I'm wondering if you could explain for our audience what a social innovation lab is.
Sure, yeah. So I think also the question of what social innovation labs are is evolving and emerging. Right now, that whole field, it's not a set established thing, so it's a pretty exciting time where there's lots of practitioners, lots of different groups trying to figure out what this is and make it better and make it impactful. So the way I understand social innovation labs is it moves beyond just talking about issues, and there's a real action doing side to them, and testing and prototyping and trying some ideas around it. So about 10 to 15 years ago, in my experience, a lot of how we were going to make change in the disability space was around, well, we'll do world cafes, and if we get people together and have conversations and get unlikely people there, and we talk about it, then this kind of natural self-organizing thing will emerge, and people will start to work on challenges together, and stuff will be solved. And my experience with leading those and with being part of many of those was that was only one piece. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of these stages in labs today, and that was, you know, in now kind of some of the language around it, that was good for kind of an empathy stage, a stage to understand issues and talk about those things, really important, but often there wasn't an action side to it and testing those things. So social innovation labs, to me, and kind of the work we're exploring around it, is a bias towards action, to understand a challenge, to understand assumptions, really pick at those assumptions around what the issues are, and then moving to an action side where we say, okay, so let's dream big, what could we imagine, and let's not just talk about it, but let's actually make some models and some examples of that and test those and see how they work. So it's real kind of, it's not totally new, it's the convergence. Social innovations lab is the convergence of a whole bunch of things coming together, from appreciative inquiry to human-centered design thinking to systems thinking, all of those kinds of things. So it's many of those things converging, and people are kind of messing around in this space trying to make things better around complex issues.
That's a really good start, I think, for our conversation, because what you've described for us is, you know, how some new processes emerged, like the conversation cafes and so on, that began to open up pathways. And it sounds like, from what you said, that then the next step in this development, as the pathways begin to open up, was this movement then to, we're going to move beyond talk now, we're going to move into action. And I'm wondering if you can give us an example, really, maybe you know, something that begins to describe for people maybe a challenge that you're working on right now, for example, and how you're working through it in a lab process.
Sure. So there's a lot of examples. I think one actually was just recently, which actually, okay, now if I could take over the screen, I'm going to show some pictures. Okay, you're all in there. You can see.
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, so so this was actually just a little while ago. So this was a lab session called Design by Doing, and it was something that Skill Society put on with the Alberta CoLab, Make Something Edmonton, City of Edmonton, and a whole bunch of newcomers that were. There was some stuff that was identified around struggling with systems navigation, some tricky pieces around that, and so people come into this lab, this space where it's a creative, fun space where we can kind of tackle an issue, make sense of it. So there's things on the walls. It's called an empathy map. You'll see in that picture where people are trying to understand people's experience with kind of a struggle they're having around different systems and services they want to access. And then we came up with a whole bunch of ideating and possibilities, so not just talking about it, but moving to, okay, what could be some things that could help? And so lots of sticky notes, sometimes death by sticky notes, sometimes too many sticky notes, and then starting to prototype some of these pieces. So actually in this first picture there was this prototype around a policy change, and there was a baby in there. I think this was the coolest prototype I've ever seen in a lab, where it was this space baby representing policy change around this particular thing that was going on. So there's something about it where you're moving from just talking about to something tangible. So that's more kind of the Skills Society Action Lab is a revenue generator for skills. So we convene and steward these labs as well in lots of different areas. So we get better at labs through doing this, and we help community around these types of things, and learn along the way. So this is that's one very recent example from just a weekend ago.
So Ben, just let me jump in here, because there's a couple of things I wanted to ask about. So because when I'm looking at that photograph and the space baby, is what's happening in the photograph is that people have begun to imagine the future, and they're describing it through those kinds of images and creative pieces that they have around them.
That's right. Yeah. So in this case, and there's now going to be some further pieces with some of these prototypes we're exploring. So in this piece, they were looking at a peer group and what that would look like. And so yeah, they're starting to imagine, they're starting to make ideas tangible and see the links between them, and which digs at assumptions and helps to make those ideas visual, helps to see things a little clearer and test those things. So now there's a whole bunch of work to do after this, but there's something about it when you're thinking through your hands and making those ideas tangible, that something shifts and changes than just talking about ideas.
So Ben, does it have to be a designated space, a room? When Vickie and I first began exploring the benefits of social innovation labs, we actually were in Denmark, and we went to one of the oldest labs in the world. It's called Mind Lab, and they actually had a room oval shaped. I guess that was the perception of the shape of our mind. It was all painted white. You could write on the walls. The thing was, they never used it. So it looked good. It was symbolic. And I'm wondering if you encountered the same thing. And for our listeners, does it have to be a dedicated room or a dedicated building, or can you set it up anywhere? And if so, what do you need? So
I'd say it depends, and it's both. When we first had something called the Citizen Action Lab, we called it a think tank, which was trying to get, and I'll show you some examples a little bit later on, around inclusion experiences for people with disabilities, citizenship experiences, really boosting that. We knew that we couldn't just have them in one place, that had to be mobile, so we created these mobile pop-up lab kits that could go anywhere in community, where we have these storytelling and action labs around these issues. And so they have to be mobile. You can't just do these things in an ivory tower. Sometimes it's not appropriate to do this. So we have this, you're looking at this picture, this real beautiful space. It's a social enterprise of Skills Society, and it's really something else. It's we have described that the feeling we wanted early on was like going through the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You go through the wardrobe, and you're in this other world. And so, oh, looks like something just changed there. Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so we wanted to really have this playful space there, but it's both. There's also times when the work we have to do, it has to be out in community, and a fancy space like this isn't always the appropriate one. So what's necessary is, on the other hand, having a place that it provokes and jars new thinking and is thought-provoking can be really helpful to knock people out of just the usual patterns of doing the same old, same old. So there is something to having spaces that does mirror to people, hey, we gotta think and do things differently. So there is some, and there's a lot of evidence, and there's a lot of research around that the types of environments we create are important. So yes, that's important, and we also need to be careful that we don't just think, the creative stuff only happens in this 2,500 square foot room, cool room, that it also happens out in community. So we often think of this space as being like base camp, and then we go on the kind of explorations out in community where we need to research and look into challenges and do stuff with community. So it's a both and kind of approach around that.
It's a really good point, because I know that if I'm wanting to if you will, challenge myself, change my way of thinking, I almost have to get myself out of the habitat I'm familiar with, my familiar room with all the familiar surroundings, and the phone is easy and somebody can throw me a message, etc. And so I think fundamentally what you're saying is, it's important to have a dedicated place that's different than where we normally work or converse or indeed play.
Yeah.
I
so
noticed.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
So if in this current slide, this is one of the early, before it was called the Citizen Action Lab, was one of our think tanks, and it's just a bunch of couches brought together, and people decorated the space the way we wanted, but it had to have this comfortable vibe so that people could be. Okay, so these spaces, it's all about how do we help people free up the space that they can trust, they can relax to let ideas flow. That's really the key thing that's important. So yeah, you can create, you don't have to have a fancy space necessarily, but some thought around that can be helpful than just going to a typical boardroom type thing.
Okay, Ben, and I'm not sure everybody, we're having trouble seeing your slide, so let's hope that that others are. It looks like you've got them on here, and actually that's a good slide to focus on. I'm really curious about who comes to the lab, who gets invited, and you talk a lot about the importance of the unusual suspects, and in a lot of your slides there's a lot of people sitting around the table who we wouldn't necessarily associate with the disability world, so you're mixing and matching all the time. So who comes, and is this another variation of Nothing About Us Without Us? How big does the table have to be, and who are you inviting?
Well, it depends on the context. So if it's labs in kind of the inclusion, citizenship, disability space, then that's a little bit different thing for us so far, what we're learned than if we're doing something for community around like poverty and things like that. So it depends on what the complex issue you're tackling is. But there's definitely a pattern that you don't want just all the people that think the same to be in these types of explorations, right? You want diversity of perspective, diversity of experience, all that kind of stuff. So if I show you, so let me show you a little bit about the Citizen Action Lab here. So this is about 8 to 10 years in the making. It's only been called the Citizen Action Lab for about 3 to 4 years. And people coming into this, so as you see, the key question is how do we enhance the citizenship experience of people with disabilities? And the other key thing is how do we help support workers really unlock and think differently? So one of the leverage points we found was if we help supports really unlock that creativity in their minds, that we go on the assumption it's there, it might just have gotten lost along the way. It's there. If we can open that up, then it can help carve new possibilities towards discovering what people really want that will make their life rock and be, full engaged citizens. So we started out where we had everybody, in a person's support network would be there, and we had people with disabilities there at these conversations, and exploring that. And we found actually that when we did that, that people were really scared to say things and come up with ideas for fear of offending and things like that. And so we had to kind of scratch our heads and thought, how do we navigate this? How do we figure this out to make it really ethical and Nothing About Us Without Us and all of those pieces, and also free up some creativity and new thinking. So we experimented with that for quite some time and tried things, and in the end we found we had to do more of the ethnographic side, so more of that hanging out with people or the traditional kind of, not traditional, but ways of discovering people's strengths, gifts, out in community and talking with people in conversation. We had to do more of that beforehand, and then people coming to these labs would help kind of ideate, come up with ideas, and then we check with people, how does this fit, does this make sense around this, and what would you like to explore? So always really being careful we don't make decisions for people or to people and weird people out around that. So there's a tricky tension there, but we found that actually the key leverage point was around staff trying to break open thinking around that was the key point that we needed to work with. It wasn't about breaking creativity open to people with disabilities and their families. That's there. So very often at these action labs, we have people that know a person really well, sometimes a family member, as well as people that are unusual or so diverse perspectives around it, so that if somebody's been working with somebody for many years, sometimes that has a certain way of seeing a person that can be really beneficial and sometimes limiting at the same time in terms of thinking that there might not everything's been tried before. So we bring lots of diverse people there together. So I'm going to show you an example of what this looks like. Yeah, it looks like it can. So this team has already done some of the ethnographic side, so they've already learned from a person some strengths and kind of who a person is, and they're coming together. So this is a small piece of this exploration. So this is this kind of empathy phase that happens before a lab, so they've learned about somebody. And this is Todd, who we've learned about, and Todd lets us tell his story. So in learning about Todd, they went and hung out beforehand and said, weed whacking's like meditation. Work means value for money, and smoke's in a truck. And any place I can hang, smoke, and chat with people is awesome. So it's kind of this like learning who people are and what they're really excited about rather than our biases of how we think they should be. So going and learning in that way. And then coming back, learning from Todd, all these ideas so we get explored. So you see at the top there, the discovery, strengths, connections, meaningful roles, and action around possibilities around that. So lots of kind of riffing on his interests. There's this phase where we diverge with lots of possibilities, and then we converge around, okay, what are we sensing, Todd? Really, what has Todd told us he's really stoked about? What are we sensing also? It's kind of reading between the lines of what he's really excited about. And we converge on possibilities. We make ideas visual, which helps to see our own assumptions and what could be wrong and how it might not line up with what Todd wants, as well as it helps to present ideas down the road around, if somebody struggles with reading and writing, the visual piece makes it really more accessible. And then testing, so this was going out and looking about Todd starting up a little handyman business type thing, so he's going and checking out these tools and things. And then you iterate and you go, wow, that didn't quite land, so we go back and maybe that's not it, maybe he won't have that connection with people that is really the motivator for him, so maybe we could connect him with some other handyman, he could have that connection as well and offer his strengths in that way. So this whole testing and checking that out, so this is then going with Todd after and doing that. So this is kind of what those explorations look like, and they're not always kind of clean and linear in this way, and we have to kind of come back together and explore and see what is necessary going forward. But that diversity in the perspectives is really key, so we always try to bring in some people that have fresh perspective as well as people that know them. Hope that answers a little bit.
Yeah, that's really a great illustration. It strikes me that what you've done is really expand our thinking about the term, inclusion, when we're trying to get people's voices absolutely front and center, and often we've used our more traditional means of doing that, like they must be in the room or attend the meeting, all of those kinds of things, as opposed to what is really a much more, from what I see, a much more sophisticated way of listening. What you're describing is the ethnographic approach. It is the being with the person and listening while being in relationship with them. So that's quite a beautiful image in my mind, anyway, of some of the work that you do. I'm curious because you're taking on some pretty entrenched challenges. For example, the idea of bringing creativity into established service systems. And I'm wondering how you mark your progress. How do you know if it's working?
Yeah, outcomes, that's a good one. It's tricky. I mean, I think this is one, it's actually, okay, I got a good slide. Just one sec, we got a good one here. So, you can still see the screen?
Mm-hmm.
So, tricky, I love this, is from Mark Cabage. Tricky thing with most systems today, it's this pendulum swing around. You have to know results before you even begin, so they're very performance oriented. So when we go for procurement, when we go for grants and things, you have to tell and say, like, we know exactly this is the place, right? The tricky thing is that innovation and really finding new pathways forward that work for people, social innovation, is on the other side. And the tricky thing I think we're all trying to figure out is that radical middle. So it's not either or, and this is what systems are trying to figure out around this. So a lot of when we're trying to explore, like, how do we know? On one level, at an individual level, it's, well, you check with people and you find out, is this making your life rock better than before, than kind of usual ways of working. So that's one piece, talking to families, talking to individuals around that, stories around that. That's at an individual level. And then there's other things we're exploring, like through this My Compass app, where we're trying to also explore, you know, other ways of looking at quality of life and how we can make some progress in those areas. But I think it's a big question, you know, around how do we know we're making impact, not just at an individual level, but on bigger scale, you know, around that. And in dealing with something as complex as people's lives, it's a real tricky thing to explore. So I think one, we're doing some things right, we're mindful of that, and at the same time, we're also saying, hey, we need some space to be able to try and do some things, because business as usual has not really been working for people's lives or for systems. And at the same time, we want to be able to track. So one thing we are doing is, in one of our labs, is we're using developmental evaluation, where developmental evaluation is really, as I know so far in being mentored by Mark Cabage around this, is around protecting the innovators and the explorations in that space. And it's really around this kind of emergent learning, rather than you know exactly where you're going to end up along the way. So this developmental evaluation piece to really be tuned into, okay, we're noticing these signals and these patterns, we need to pay attention to this. We thought we were going to go in this direction. Now we're actually hearing people are telling us this is the important thing, we need to pay attention to that. So I think there's things like developmental evaluation which are really key to exploring impact of labs, and are they doing well. I think another thing is, we try not to just talk about only the good things. We really try to also say, like, hey, these are some things that aren't working. You know, these are some pieces we have to tweak, and not always trying to sugarcoat things. So I think that's a real key piece to be honest about in that way. So we try to walk a talk around that.
Just for our listeners, we'll certainly, as a part of the summary and so on, put into the links some information around developmental evaluation. For, you know, just if you're interested in this approach. Ben, I'm curious because you know, we live in a time where there's just so much complexity, and people get anxious when they don't have the answers. And there's certainly some trend actually towards people turning to more simplistic solutions, even though they may not be the ultimate solutions. They seem to calm people, and they say, yes, I'll go for that. And so when we get into this question of outcomes, you know, I'm thinking about your sponsors and your backers who are walking this with you, perhaps with a financial investment or a commitment of time and so on. How do you keep them engaged when, you know, there is such a huge amount of ambiguity?
And so I think some of it is finding those innovative groups that want to support. So the groups we're working with are End Poverty Edmonton in the city that have a mandate that they want to try some new things. Edmonton Community Foundation, probably one of the most innovative foundations in walking their talk around really exploring labs and collective impact and things like that. So I think one is you have to find allies that are willing to say, yeah, this approach, like this slide here with the weird poodle there, what happens when we have to know results before we even start? You know, well, we create solution services, systems, products based mostly on deep biased assumptions and not figuring out what people really need. And so when we talk to funders and organizations that are willing to say, yeah, that does happen a lot. We build a lot of things based on a lot of assumptions, and that isn't really working, and we need to keep that in check. So yeah, let's try these approaches. So it's I think it's more in the zeitgeist these days that groups and organizations are more and more open to these approaches, as long as we can kind of track learning along the way and be really transparent about what's working, not working. So that's a key thing that we build into it. So that's, again, developmental evaluation around it, and groups that are willing to go on a ride with us to say, let's build this knowledge together, and that's a real key thing. And there's a lot of groups that want to do that. They don't want to they want to build something together, whether that's building new knowledge together or new services or systems. So I think you're looking for groups that are open in that way. We collaborate quite a bit with the Alberta CoLab, which is a government lab, probably one of the coolest government lab groups in Canada, honestly. Some really amazing work going on there. And so like that Design by Doing lab I showed earlier, we collaborated with government on that, and that's it. So you need those groups as well working on this to really explore from multiple angles. If it's only the community side, there's only so far you can go. If it's only the government side pushing and trying to shift systems, there's only so far you can go. So we need some kind of hybrid between, and have those all stakeholders from the system there at the table trying to make change on a complex issue.
Thanks, Ben. Just a reminder to our listeners, flip your questions our way. If you've got one or two or three, let us know. We're a little bit more than halfway through the chat. And so it'd be great to have your input as well. Ben, I think it's almost in the water supply or in the air we breathe is this notion that we have to make everything we do fail-safe. I think that's kind of what Mark Cavage is getting at. You know, when it's so ironic. You start a social change journey, and it's really an exploration, because you can never be 100% sure, and yet the expectation that we place on ourselves and that funders and other people place on us is that we have to make it fail-safe. But in fact, I think what you are doing and what labs can do, and labs in this regard can help government, people in the community, service providers, policymakers, funders, is create a safe place to fail. So that one of the functions of a lab is to move from fail-safe to safe to fail. Do you have a comment on that whole question of failure and making mistakes? Because I'm pretty sure that that's a lot of what happens in a lab.
Yeah, so when it comes to that prototyping piece, so you can still see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, there's a tricky thing with the whole fail idea. So one is, if we talk to people with disabilities we're supporting and their families and say, hey, we're going to fail a lot, you know, we just need room to fail, that's not cool, right? You can't mess with people's lives and fail with supporting people's lives. So there's a tricky thing, I think, and I've heard this come up, we've had a lot of conversations around it. At that individual level, it's like, we can't be failing. So that's a tricky tension. And yet at the systems and service level, we need room to try some new things and to explore. And Skills Society, who I mainly work with in this social R&D function is really kind of invested in let's try some stuff and let's see what. And the other thing is with this is understanding all social innovations have a shelf life. So there's a time that they exist for, that they meet the needs, and then we have to be open to changing or altering them or letting them go and trying something new around it. And where I think we can get into trouble is if we try to sustain something way beyond its shelf life, and then it gets awkward and weird around that. So there's an element of, we can ask, like, is business as usual working? Well, no. Okay, so then we need some new approaches to explore. And so it's more around, we need to be able to test those potential services or policies or explorations and see what works, and test those with people quickly and rapidly without unleashing a full program plan. So go to this slide. So a common and often short-sighted way of leading change, it's this, so at the top you have this top-down approach. You convene senior leaders, policymakers, an expert gives an opinion, we make new programs or interventions, we unleash it on people, and we hope the plan works. And this happens right from, you know, government level to organizations to in a lot of different ways, that we make these things in our ivory towers with a lot of assumptions and get into trouble when we roll it out and people go, that isn't what we needed. So one of the things that can help tame that kind of failure around it is this human-centered design approach. Is one piece. It's not everything, but it's one piece. Where people are first, we think about what could trigger change, what's deeply needed. We prototype and test early, and we say some of those prototypes, those didn't work. We let them fail cheaply and quickly, and we try some new stuff. And along the way, we have policy change champions that can help open doors and are gatekeepers in different systems to find the good ones that can work to go forward. So I think there is a tricky challenge of, at an individual level, we can't fail people, and yet we need the ability to try some stuff and not just go for kind of hubris, thinking that something we're creating is going to work right out of the gate, right?
So, you know, I'm actually surprised how quickly the time is marching on here, and so I wanted to just jump from, ultimately, from what you might say, from failure to success in this question. And it would be really great, Ben, if you had just a few quick examples of things that have worked or are working. Just examples. So, you know, we've talked about the rapid prototyping, we've talked about the safe fail, all of that. I mean, where are some quick solutions, get some quick examples of solutions that are in play and making a difference and contributing to the citizenship experience of people with disabilities?
So what comes to mind at the moment is you have to do, and so there's an article on ThinkJar Collective around tools versus culture. So I think there's a tendency that we all, it's a human thing, we all hope for those simple silver bullets, or those some simple solutions, quick fixes that are going to save us. You know, we're going to do these things well. So let's learn this secret formula and make this happen, whether that's labs or human-centered design thinking or things like that. So I think one of the things, the pattern that can help to be successful, is to give that up and realize it is tricky and complex. It's not just about tools. It's about these different tools for change as well as the culture building. And so at my home organization, Skills Society, we've done a ton around culture building. It's taken many years. It's a long game approach. It's not usually a sexy approach to kind of just go after tools. It takes quite a bit of work, and there's a lot of uncertainty in it. But when you do that well, so this exploration, this being willing to try things, not being that you free up permission to help people be creative, to create environments where people can think and do differently, to use new processes to see how that can make progress on a complex challenge. All of those things are some of this culture building work, to have playfulness in your workplace that builds trust, which can lead to better problem solving, things like that. Those are all patterns that we've learned and found really does help have staying power and helps to make progress. So you need culture and tools. If you just do tools, you won't get very far with it. So that's a real key thing we've learned. The Citizen Action Lab, we are constantly tweaking. That's been really successful to open up new thinking in our employees And we have 9 stewards of that right now that kind of have this process and do this in community and in our lab. And we're always tweaking it. So there's pieces right now we're like, you know, the follow through is really tricky. We're not quite really winning in that space, or it's not really, there's some stuff that we're falling down in there. And so some team members said, well, let's prototype something and we're going to present it back to our stewardship team and see what we can do from there, and then we're going to test it and see how that works. So I think this whole approach of these human-centered design approach of prototype and test is kind of shifted also the culture of how we problem solve. And there's something really promising about that. Any other success? Yep.
Ben, we're getting a flutter of Twitter. I don't know if that's the right phrase or not, but a lot of questions coming in, and I want to try.
Okay, go for it. Go for it. Yeah.
I want to try and get to them all selfishly while we have you. So maybe this will be more rapid fire now.
Sure.
So the first question is, people can see how allies fit into the process, how friends, you know, bring together folks. But, you know, how do you engage strangers and adversaries, people you don't like or you don't know, people who have betrayed you or have hurt you or you've hurt them, and, you know, they're a little leery of participating. So I think folks are really captivated by what you're about here, and they're now drilling down a little bit. So a quick example perhaps of how you've reached out beyond the usual.
A quick example. So again, it depends on the context. It depends on the situation. So, you know, where we're working with people with disabilities kind of in the Citizen Action Lab approach, that's a little bit different, where we have you want to have that diverse group there, but it's not strangers, you know, always there. And there's some ethical things around it. So that's one thing. When it comes to kind of zooming out and higher up around kind of policy issues, yeah, in terms of like, you want to have all the stakeholders in the system there. So sometimes there can be a tendency to just have users or people or experiencers of challenges in the system, and people forget you need to have some of the government folks, and you need to have agencies there. And so you need to have everybody there, not just kind of empathy for one stakeholder in there. So how you do that, you frame it right, you have the context right, and you say we're trying to make some change around this, and you have really good stewardship. We don't really talk about facilitation, it's kind of cold. We talk about kind of embedded in the process, so we talk about stewardship. And you need to have really good people that are able to steward an exploration where it's a mix of creativity, people being able to be real about what's going on. So it's part of how you put the rails on those as well.
I've heard people often say that this process of bringing together you know, strangers and adversaries, if you will, is the process of building trust. So it doesn't happen overnight, and that often the work occurs before you sit down at the table in the lab. It's a ton of outreach beforehand, reaching out to people, not so much saying I got a better idea or I got a solution, but more just trying to find common ground that what we have, what's existing, isn't working as well as it could be or should be. And I've heard other folks who are in the same boat as you, who are lab practitioners, say that that's a really helpful place to start. Not trying to convince people of anything other than getting common agreement that things aren't working as well as they could be. And that leads me to another question that's come in from our listeners, which is when you first gathered together, this listener is suggesting when they do that, what they end up doing is complaining about the system. And it strikes me that that's not a constructive or productive place to start. So this question is a very practical one. Once you've built the trust and got people interested in trying something new or different, what's the conversation starter?
Yeah, so I was looking for a slide. I don't have it here, but one of the things that we have is we call the Action Lab Agreement. And so it's on a pillar in the wall, on the wall, and people also have these kind of tent cards in the lab, and it's basically some guidelines for the conversation. So it's things like be curious, be careful of our judgments and biases, practice something from Peter Senge called reflective openness, which helps when we're critiquing, when we're in that phase of converging and we need to kind of pick ideas. There's a tendency as people, we just kind of say, oh, it's a dumb idea. We have all of our experience, and past stuff caught up in that, and reflective openness helps to say, well, here's where my perspective is coming from. Here's where it might be colored by this bias or this experience, and tell me about that. So asking questions from there. So it's 10 things that help kind of guide these conversations. And later on, I can send you links. We have those if people want to see them, are available. It's not secret or anything like that. So those kinds of things really help. And also the groups have to create some of their own ground rules to really buy into it. What kind of values? So we do things in the beginning of labs around what kind of values do we want expressed? What can we do and say to sustain trust? I hate it when people say like, oh, just trust each other. It doesn't work at all, ever. And usually people in power say that so that people will agree with them. So we really kind of get into the nitty-gritty around, well, what are things people can do and say, and then how do we give that to each other so we can have good conversations and good action.
Great, beautiful. Lots of, I really like the guidance, if you will, around process in this way, because it's clear from all you said that the process is really what underpins this. The principles of your process, if you will. So it's rich to hear the specifics here. We did promise that we would also, aside from labs, that we would talk for a moment about the Think Jar Collective. And we're really curious about what led you to create the collective, and maybe just a reference or two to some of the resources that are on that site. It's quite spectacular.
Thanks. Yeah, so that came out of my graduate studies in about 2010 around basically this question of how do we really open up creativity, like disciplined creativity, disciplined innovation in organizations. And one of the patterns that came out, and as we know, as the Impact book talks about and things, is around we need to get out of our silos and we need to mash up ideas and disciplines and get these creative collisions happening, because that's often at the heart of where better possibilities can emerge. And so thought of Think Jar Collective. So it's not just it's kind of a play on words of a jar of ideas, but also stuff that jars you, that shakes you out of those habits, because one way of looking at creativity is being able to jiggle up habits and think beyond just what we're used to and see new possibilities. And the older we get and the more set in our ways we get, the harder it is and the more we have to really work to kind of build those new possibilities. So it's so Think Jar came together as a collective of people in diverse domains that are doing really interesting, innovative work. So we have people from the social sector, we have people in design, we have people in artificial intelligence, we have some of the top creativity experts like Michael Michalko, Scott Barry Kaufman, researchers in what creativity is and what how to do it better as people in organizations. And so there's a lot of content. There's interviews and there's tips and tools and stuff on culture around basically if an organization or people are looking at how do we get more creativity and not just make it this frilly kind of extra thing, but actually lead towards navigating complex times, complex issues. It's a whole bunch of resources and people working on these types of issues. So the jar of ideas and jarring content that makes you go, whoa, I never thought of that type of collision. So I came out of I think what's really exciting is when domains collide and then something new and different emerges that really helps me that to me is exciting stuff when it happens.
Great, Ben. It's another question that's come in, and it's one that I think may be on everyone's lips, which is how big or how small can labs be? Now, I'm familiar with labs that redesign forms just to kind of improve the application form, if you will. And I'm familiar with labs that essentially have been responsible for designing all the tools on the internet. That's the Media Lab at MIT, for example. Skills Society, where you're based, you're using the lab for multiple purposes, including improving the services that you offer. Now, I know there are many listeners out there who have really bold ambitions. They want to reignite the disability movement, or they have a national challenge or a large regional or provincial challenge. So in your experience, can labs go big as well as be precise?
Yeah, I think it depends on what the lab is trying to tackle. So if labs are only about spaces, that's a shallow kind of weird thing. So, you know, be careful of where it's like it only becomes about the space. At the same time, space can be helpful to be thinking differently. If you're talking more about design labs versus kind of systems change labs or some hybrid of both, then that's also different. So a lot of like MIT or these things around products, and some of the critique around human-centered design is that it's maybe too focused on kind of, it came from kind of product development space, and how does that work with real complex issues. So there usually needs to be some kind of hybrid with systems thinking. So you can have both the worm's eye view of human-centered design thinking and the bird's eye view of systems thinking. Or some of my friends like Alex Ryan and Karen Perler at the CoLab are really talking about systemic design, which is a hybrid of systems thinking and design thinking, which is really important. So I think it depends. If we're working with complexity, like one of our labs, the Shift Lab, which is a partnership with Edmonton Community Foundation and the Skills Society Action Lab, it's looking at this intersection of racism and poverty. Really messy, really complex. We have a lab team of 18 that is working on this, and it's really messy stuff, and we're working with systems thinking and design thinking to try to make progress on this. So it depends, and I think some labs, they might want to just stay small. So I think it's actually a big question everyone's trying to figure out. You know, are labs only beneficial if they scale and replicate? Yeah, I'm skeptical of that. I think that some need to be kind of neighborhood and community specific maybe. Some need to be around, I don't know if they need to kind of scale us to some huge massive thing. We'll see, but it's spreading in the social innovation ecosystem, these approaches, and I think it's an exciting time that it's too early to tell around what exactly are the right approaches with it, but we need to be asking questions around kind of like how we don't want to oversimplify things. We want to try some of these new approaches, find what's working, not working, and boost this knowledge together in this ecosystem of labs.
We've got time just for a final question here, Ben, and I'm going to invite you to go to the bird's eye view. I love that phrase, by the way, worm's eye view and bird's eye view. From the bird's eye view, we've heard you say that the disability movement hasn't had its liberation moment yet, and we wonder what you mean by that, and if you think we're really ripe, we're at a moment for a big advancement.
Well, I think like you know, I have a stepbrother with really severe disability, so I know some of the family experience as well, and I've worked in the field for 17 years, and one of the things kind of I thought I was going to be in the art and design space 18 years ago. That's what thought I was going to do, and really saw that still people with disabilities haven't really had their liberation movement like a lot of other marginalized groups, and yes, it's not all these groups still need a lot of help, but in particular I think people with disabilities are often left behind, and so there's still a lot of work to do to get to a place where people are truly valued as citizens like any other citizen is afforded in society and community. So there also aren't established practices that always work in every situation, and we need to be adaptive and flexible around that. And so there's still a lot of work to be done in this, and in some ways that's really sobering, and in other ways it's kind of exciting in terms of there's pioneering work to keep learning and growing around.
So thanks, Ben. Thanks for shining a light on our challenges, but also in the disability world, but also thanks for shining a light on the related challenges that we face as a society. Ted, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thanks, Al. Well, that was a rich conversation. Thank you, Al, Vickie, and Ben. I'm thinking about what my takeaways are, and one of the things I really liked was just the idea of starting with empathy. To me, that really resonated with me. And then the other thought was about inviting all of the stakeholders to the table, not just our friends, and making a commitment that we solve this together. Both of those resonated deeply with me. Thank you all. To those that have joined us today, your comments and your questions help to make this a dynamic and a thought-provoking conversation. I also want to thank our partners who have supported Plan Institute and Tamarack in hosting this webinar series. You've helped to make this possible. To our listeners, please remember to look for an email later this week with links to our audio and other materials related to today's webinar. It will include a discount code for the purchase of Al's book. As always, we welcome your feedback, and so please email us and let us know how we are doing and how we can make this webinar series better. I look forward to having you all join us at our next webinar on Tuesday, November the 29th. It will begin at 9 o'clock Pacific and 12 o'clock Eastern. And the impact idea for discussion will be Mobilize Your Economic Power with Liz Mulholland, CEO of Prosper Canada. Finally, a reminder that you need to register for each of the webinars individually, so if you've not done so already, please go online and register for the next webinar session. We have more exciting events and resources available. Visit our website at planinstitute.ca or rdsp.com and sign up for a monthly e-zine. Again, thanks everyone for joining us. Glad you could spend the morning with us. Have a great day.